lo que vas a escuchar es una entrevista con uno de los pensadores para mí más estimulantes del momento. Vamos a levantar vuelo un rato. SRNICEK es economista, es doctor en relaciones internacionales, es canadiense, tiene 40 años y enseña en Londres, en el King's College. Es un estudioso de ese intersticio entre la economía política y la tecnología. Y la verdad, repito, uno de los tipos que más lúcidamente analiza este momento del capitalismo con sus tremendas desigualdades y la emergencia de grandes magnates que nunca habíamos visto tan poderosos. En primera instancia le pregunté, voy a compartir 3 cachitos de una entrevista que le hicimos, que después van a poder ver en mis redes sociales, en @aleberco o en las redes sociales aquí de C5N también, pero 3 fragmentitos de 3-4 minutos para hablar. En este primero conversamos justamente sobre la naturaleza de esas plataformas sobre las cuales se monta la desigualdad y esos magnates.
What extent does the mode of accumulation of what you call platform capitalism explain this inequality, this record inequality and the emergence of tycoons richer than ever in human history?
I think part of it has to do with the nature of platforms. So platforms, a very basic definition is simply that they're intermediaries. They bridge between 2 different groups. You can take a social media platform like Facebook, for instance. What it effectively does as a business is connect users with each other, but also users with advertisers, users with companies, users with app developers, all of this sort of stuff. This is what platforms are really good at. Now, what's interesting about them, among many things, but in terms of the sort of concentration of wealth and power, is that they are very easy to scale up. So we've seen extremely quick growth of these platforms. You know, they go from nothing to suddenly having, you know, billions of users in a period of a year, 2 years. So they can scale up very, very quickly. They are, I don't want to say asset light, because they often rely upon massive data infrastructure to sustain themselves, but they don't have to like build a new factory in each country. So they can go into a new country very, very easily, which gives them a global footprint in a way that's sort of unprecedented in many ways. So you've got rapid scaling, you've got a global footprint. And then I think also really important is the fact that they're not limited to one sector. And what we've seen with all of these major platforms is that they're expanding themselves into new areas. So Google is not just a search engine. No, it's like the smallest part of the business now. It's what they're known for. But Google is doing all sorts of other things simply because that platform business model allows them to enter in. The cloud computing infrastructure of Amazon is fundamental to basically any business that's operating in the global economy today, which gives them you know, a real sort of power and influence over these other markets. Monopolies beforehand were typically in, you know, one industry. You got a railroad monopoly or an electricity monopoly, or
steel,
like that, an oil
yes,
monopoly. Steel, exactly. With the platforms, they just expand and expand and expand. I think that is sort of unprecedented and a big part of the reason why there's such a massive concentration of wealth and power and profit within them.
So, should we expect more of that in the next few years?
I think so, yeah.
Espera que se agudice este fenómeno. Busquen este libro, Capitalismo de Plataformas. Lo publicó en 2016 SRNICEK, que es a su vez autor del Manifiesto Aceleracionista. Repito, es un tipo muy, muy interesante y habla de eso que está ocurriendo ahora. En un ratito pongo otra respuesta sobre el auge de la ultraderecha. A SRNICEK, el economista y tecnólogo canadiense que entrevisté y que, bueno, ya compartimos un fragmentito, también le pregunté sobre el auge de la ultraderecha, un auge que ocurre a nivel mundial y que, bueno, también tuvo sus vaivenes, por lo cual otra pregunta también yuxtapuesta fue, ¿qué pasa con esa ultraderecha cuando finalmente le toca gobernar? Escuchen lo que respondió.
How should we fight it in case we have to, and how do you think they will manage state in case of occupying it?
I think, one of the things, sort of watching the rise of the far right across Europe in particular, one of the things that has made them successful that the left hasn't necessarily done as well is tell a story of what the past 40, 50 years is all about. Particularly a popular story. You have academic stories about what's been happening over the past 40 years, sort of summarized in neoliberalism. But you don't have that sort of popular story that links with people's individual lives and individual experiences in a way that the far right has been able to do. I think, it is the social base of the far right in Europe, at least, seems to be largely older populations in general. There are some exceptions in, I think, Italy and things like that. But largely older populations, largely home-owning populations, propertied, and largely, I would say, sort of upper middle class. They're not necessarily the wealthiest people. The true sort of capitalists of these countries are not necessarily on board with the far right. And I think you saw this quite well with Trump, where when Trump was trying to, sort of take over after the election that he'd lost, companies just said no. And that's quite different from what happened in, say, the 1930s, when companies aligned themselves with the fascist movements. So I think, the capitalists at the moment largely see themselves more oriented towards a sort of technocratic center rather than a far-right populism. In terms of when they get in power, I mean, generally they seem to be somewhat limited. The sort of bonfire of regulations, much as Elon Musk with Twitter is going to find out, trying to just cut out all the rules and allow anything to go doesn't really work out in practice. And this is actually a big part of the neoliberal story, is that, well, we're going to get rid of all these regulations, we'll get rid of all these constraints on companies, and then they find out, well, this leads to a whole bunch of social conflicts, and they end up having to roll back. So whether or not they'll be able to do anything in power, I'm not sure too significantly. The real risk, I think, is the sort of collective, the building of far-right collectives across governments. So, Orban in Hungary, Johnson to some degree in the UK, Bolsonaro in Brazil and things like that. If those countries start connecting up, I think the sort of international aspects and the international growth of the far right in that way is a very scary thing. Not necessarily for what they'll do to governments immediately, but in the medium term, that is setting the conditions for something that's very dangerous.
Repito, la entrevista completa con NICS-RISEK, este canadiense de 40 años, que para mí es uno de los pensadores más interesantes en este momento sobre la economía y la tecnología, la vas a poder ver en redes sociales. Un tercer fragmentito, cortito, de lo que piensa él sobre las criptomonedas, que cuando publicó su libro, Capitalismo de Plataformas, en 2016, recién aparecían como algo realmente muy novedoso y para muy poquitos hackers. Escuchá lo que dice porque te va a sorprender.
Will they make us freer? Will they make us poorer? In our countries, in particular in Latin America, for example, what would be the impact of massification of that type of currency?
I think there is potential within cryptocurrencies and blockchain more generally. I'm not someone who takes a sort of knee-jerk reaction against these things. I think there is a lot of people doing really interesting stuff with blockchains. I think what gets picked up by the media and by social media, and what is known by most people, though, is scams and NFTs and the sort of speculative bubble of Bitcoin and things like that. I think all of that is the most visible part of the blockchain space, the crypto space. But there are people who are building things which are much more progressive. And I think there's a lot of potential there. In terms of cryptocurrencies in particular, though, I think the real issue here is that they don't they don't function in the way that a modern currency should. And in particular, supply is limited, which means that you end up back to the sort of gold standard era of the early 1900s, basically. And countries left the gold standard for very good reasons. The only way to adjust to sort of balance of payments crisis and things like that was to do things like devalue your currency. The alternative was to cause massive unemployment or significantly cut the wages of your workers. And governments, rather than risk the massive social issues that were being brought about by that, they decided to go off the gold standard. Trying to reintroduce the gold standard in the 21st century seems to me like a very silly idea. So as a sovereign currency, I don't think cryptocurrencies work. That's different from central bank digital currencies, I should mention as well, because you have basically every central bank in the world right now looking at, could we introduce a digital currency? And then many of them eventually will, I think. But they'll be very different from something like blockchain, which has a built-in supply limit and a fixed amount of new Bitcoin being produced every, I think, 10 minutes.
Yeah, don't they force an additional inequality push?
They present themselves often as having the sort of accessible to everyone, open to everyone. There's a presentation, a mythology of them being all about equality. Particularly, I think the sort of populist idea of, big finance, for instance, controlling and benefiting off of everything. And basically, a lot of the cryptocurrency stuff says, well, you can get in on that too. It is, supposed to be a way in which you can gain the benefits that somebody like Goldman Sachs has been gaining over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And I think this is the allure of it for a lot of people, actually. I think a lot of people see the corruption of the system, see the way in which the system is oriented towards the benefit of a few people, and quite understandably want to get in on that, because it's one of the few ways in which you can sort of get ahead in this world. Get lucky by betting on the right cryptocurrency and you'll do really well. So it's understandable why I think a lot of people are getting involved in it, but the actual impact, all the research I've seen suggests that the inequalities continue to exist in the cryptocurrency sphere.
Realmente inspirador lo de Nick SRNICEK. Búsquenlo, busquen su libro y vamos a subir la entrevista completa a nuestras redes sociales. Nos vamos el martes que viene.